Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshall. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which were originally broadcast between 1992 and 1996, though they were later repackaged and released as The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones, somewhere around the millennium. The series is a spin-off from the hugely popular Indiana Jones franchise, with George Lucas acting as executive producer. There are 28 episodes and 4 made-for-TV films that follow the adventures of a young Indiana Jones from around 1908 to sometime just after the end of the First World War. The bulk of the episodes are set to the backdrop of the war or directly interacting with it. As you might expect, there is lots of daring-do action and a surprising amount of romance as Indy moves around the globe, bumping into well-known historical figures. Joining us is Thomas Riddle at Indy in the Classroom on Twitter, who runs the website indyintheclassroom.com. Thanks for joining us, Thomas. Let's start with Indy in the Classroom. How did that come about?
I'd been teaching with Indy since the series first came out in 1992. So I was a second-year teacher when it first aired. Back in the day, for you youngsters, I had a VHS tapes. You know, we were recording. I was recording on VCR, and then editing out the commercials and writing lesson plans and showing them in class when it fit my curriculum. And of course, breaking all kinds of copyright stuff, I'm sure. But it was a fantastic resource for teaching kids. It was a hook for teaching history, and I was a history teacher. That's what I am by trade. So over the years, I amassed a great deal of resources for teaching with young Indy. And in 2007, I became the coordinator for our school district's social studies program. So school district of 77,000 students, I was in charge of all the social studies history programming for the school district. And at that same time, I learned that the Young Indy series was coming out, as you said, repackaged into The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones and coming out on DVD, and that there were these 90 plus documentaries coming out. And so I was excited about putting together, one, seeing what those documentaries looked like, and two, putting together some type of platform from which I could share all of these wonderful resources with other educators. And so that's kind of where Indy in the Classroom came out of. I wrote a letter to Howard Rothman, who was the head of Lucasfilm licensing at the time, and told him that I was excited about the series coming out on DVD, and that I was very thrilled about the documentaries, and that I was going to teach our teachers how to incorporate this series into their classrooms, and that it was a large district, and that opportunity to present to a lot of teachers, a lot of students, getting that IP out in front of a lot of people. And then told him I was planning on putting together a student-created museum exhibition at the end of that school year called Walking Through Time with Indiana Jones, that would come out 2 weeks before Crystal Skull, and that had all these big plans. And then I remember ending by telling him, I'll keep you informed of our success. And then waited for that C&D letter to come. You can't do this. You can't do this. But they're not. Everyone I've worked with at Lucasfilm over the years are just such lovely people. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call from marketing at Lucasfilm. They said, "Hey, let's talk about this." And so that kind of got us in working with Lucasfilm on the release of the Young Indy series. And so that was a real impetus to make. I told Wes, we got to get this website up. We've got to have some content on there. So that was kind of a long story, but that's where that came from, out of that website, and we've had it ever since.
So just you mentioned you had a student curated exhibition. So just out of nosiness, What exhibitions did they come up with? What were they? What particularly resonated with them from the series?
We kind of threw it out there, to be really wide range. And I was inspired by Lucas's original, his original idea for the Young Indy series was, I think the title he came up with was A Walk Through the 20th Century with Indiana Jones. Thankfully, it was re-edited. But that notion fascinated me because we do see Indy, who's born in 1899, walk through all of these momentous events of the 20th century. And, you think about it, in Dial of Destiny, we've just landed a man on the moon. And in Attack of the Hawkmen, we're flying in biplanes, and so he's witnessed all of this change. And so with the students, I threw out there, look, you can create an exhibit around anything that interests you related to the events or people that Indy comes in contact with throughout his life. Now, we extended that into World War II because Crystal Skull was about to come out. We didn't know the extent of his involvement in the OSS, but it had already come out that Indy was a veteran of the Second World War. And so I threw that topic out there as well. And so kids could really choose things they wanted to. Like we had a really great exhibit display on the Harlem Renaissance from Mystery of the Blues, inspired by Mystery of the Blues. We had some on a lot on ancient cultures, on the Vikings, and let's see who else. We had ancient Egypt. I mean, so we had a good many there. Part of that would have been because it fit the curriculum of some of the teachers that were participating. So we had a wide range of topics, and our local science center, where I'm now the assistant director, they were the host for the exhibit. And so it was a one-day event, and set attendance records for the science center. And folks at Lucasfilm were very excited to see it, happen, because kids were involved and kids were learning with young Indy, and that was the purpose of what it was all about.
So what age would you say you're aimed at in general?
The majority of our work has been really around middle school to high school, that age. So in the States here, 6 through 12. Some of the content wouldn't be, quite be appropriate, I feel like, for the elementary grades. But starting with sixth grade, with especially with the episodes of Corey Carrier, so young Indy, when he's traveling the world to China and Egypt, meets Freud, and Jung and Adler at a dinner party in Vienna. Those are some really appropriate episodes for the younger grades, but yeah, mainly middle school to high school.
How did students get on with the First World War material? Because Indy doesn't join the American Army. He doesn't join the British Army. I've watched 6 episodes and I can't work out how. I kept going backwards trying to find out why he ended up in the Belgian Army.
Well, you have to watch the whole thing. So. Yeah, so you may have found out by now, and maybe your listeners don't know, but when he joined up with Pancho Villa in Mexico, when he was kind of had this spring break adventure, he meets a Belgian expat named Remy Baudouin. He and Remy end up becoming fast friends, and when while they're at the estate of Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, which actually was raided by Villa and his men. And they show that they find a silent film of what's happening in Europe, of the war going on in Europe. And they're showing they're showing it to all the men because they're trying to find anything to entertain themselves. And Remy starts to become regretful that he's not there doing something for his native Belgium. And so he tells Indy he's going to Belgium and going to fight. And so Indy says, "I'll go with you." And actually, in the grand scheme of the story of young Indy, of Indiana Jones, a lot of that decision is tied down to the conflict that he has with his father. His mother has died. He and his dad are really butting heads, and he's a headstrong, at that time, 17-year-old, and decides to run away, and have a grand adventure, really to get away from dad. And so that's how he ends up going with the Belgian Army. Henri Defense is the pseudonym he chooses because he goes to join up in the recruiting office and sees a sign that says no smoking. He sees the word défense in French written there. And so he goes with, because his name is Henry. They asked him, "What's your name?" He said, Henri Defense. Henri Defense. And so that's how he becomes Defense.
Did you find the students could relate to him in the Belgian app? Because it's funny, I find it just amusing that it's so un-British or un-American. It's all very French.
The Great War is deeply embedded in the psyche of British culture, much more so than here in the States. World War II is more that for us, but the First World War for the British and the French as well is so much more embedded in the psyche. And, for us, how it pretty much is taught is, hey, a war's going on. There was a stalemate. And then the U.S. comes in, they're fresh meat, and hey, the Yanks show up and we win. Yay. And that's about it. We don't see a lot of that and typically in classrooms, a lot of that mud, blood, and poppycock, is not taught. The horrors of war, the war poets, that's typically not taught. And so this series, was a great way for me to introduce the students. And as far as relating to the Belgian Army or the British or whatever, the French, because that's what they're primarily seeing. They're not seeing Americans really at all until the Lafayette Escadrille in Attack the Hawkmen. But the stories are so well written at a human level that they could identify with the humanness of what was happening, especially like we didn't talk about watching Verdun, the Verdun episode. That's the first time you see trench warfare represented on the screen in a Young Indy episode when it originally aired, although it takes place after Trenches of Hell. When you see the French come out of the trenches and just get mowed down in this futile attempt to cross no man's land. A lot of my students, I would often show that clip because that's their first visualization of what it was like to try, how futile that was to face the guns like that. And so, I think it was the humanness that they really connect with more so than the nationality at all.
Although it's quite interesting, you mentioned the Lafayette Escadrille, the Escadrille Americaine, and watching that was a reminder to me that there is this very strong relationship between France and America. And Chris can talk about the history, but I
but nobody wants him to.
I experienced someone who grew up in the US and had that education. There was always that much stronger connection with the French military effort than the British military effort. The going back to the older alliances of the War of Independence, which is why it's the Lafayette Escadrille. So I think I was surprised that it was Belgium rather than French. Why does he not join the French army? Which, of course, there's a large number of Americans who actually did go do that, either through the Air Force or quite a lot who serve in the French military as ambulance drivers.
Is it because of Remy? Because Remy's his friend, so he goes.
Yes, it's Remy's the reason he does. I've never heard George, and I'm just thinking about this, Jessica. Thanks for bringing that up. It's made me think of something. I've never heard George talk about why he chose to place Indy in the Belgian army. Now, because he could have written a character, Remy very well could have been French, and that I'm going to have to ask a friend of mine at Lucasfilm who, if he's heard of that, who's quite the expert on Young Indy. But as a storytelling trope here, I've never thought about this before. I like the fact that he joins the Belgian army because Indiana Jones is the everyman. One of the reasons he's so popular is because he's not Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's not he bleeds, he loses, he gets beat up. He's a wreck. He's a mess. He has relational issues. He's every man. He's human. And so I think that's something that as a character, people can see something of themselves in him. And so when you're looking at Belgium, they were kind of the everyman country in that conflict. They were, you had the grand, the French and their tradition, and of course the British Empire. And you had a little Belgium that was fighting tooth and nail against the Germans, first. And then, in America, and of course, there was this whole, we played up for propaganda, the heroic defense of Belgium. And so they were the little guy. And I really think that that's something I'm glad now. Again, I've never thought about this before. I can't believe it. I'm glad that he was in that in the Belgian Army because I think it would have been distracting. Of course, he's in the British Army. He's Indiana Jones. Oh, of course, he's in the French Army. He's Indiana Jones. The Belgians. What?
This sounds odd, but maybe Jessica and Angus will be able, or even you as well, Thomas. I genuinely cannot think of any other First World War media that features the Belgian Army for any period of time, if at all. And what you end up with is the most coverage the Belgian Army gets is in Young Indiana Jones. But there's also there's a geographical benefit to having him in the Belgian Army, because firstly it means he can get involved with the French, he can get involved with the British, but he also there are episodes where he's in Africa with the Belgian Army as well. And again, it sounds faintly ludicrous to say that, you know, the actual coverage of the Belgian and Allied campaign in Africa during the First World War can be found in the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. But there it is.
I mean, because the great joke about Belgium is, or the British joke about Belgium is, you know, can you think of a famous Belgian other than Tintin? One of the joys of watching these episodes for me was play Spot the famous British actor when young.
Liz Hurley. Julian Fellows plays Winston Churchill.
James Nesbitt, Edward Petherbridge was there as a French general, which was really distracting for me because when he's the actor who played Peter Wimsey, who's sort of the great fictional ex-serviceman that I work on. So that was going, no, this isn't quite working. But
it also brings us back to Emperor Palpatine, who's in 37 Days.
Yeah, and Anthony Daniels is in it as well. We've had a few episodes recently. The episodes of the podcast have been great, but we've either read something or watched something, and I think the general mood at the end of it was, I will consider that to be a film that I once watched. Whereas I had a great time watching Young Indiana Jones. It's very, very fun, and it's very, very watchable. And there's loads of weird stuff in there that makes you wonder what on earth is going on at times, but it's nicely polished. It's fun.
Well, I have to say, have you looked through the crew list of people who put it together? Terry Jones, Monty Python, Frank Darabont, who does Shawshank's one of the directors. Who else did I notice? Peter McDonald, Mike Newell, who did Four Weddings and a Funeral and Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. The oddity I did spot though was Carrie Fisher wrote the Mata Hari episode, which was then directed by Nicholas Roeg, and I have to say it was a particularly peculiar, very Nicholas Roeg feeling episode when you watched it back. But it's a tremendous cast and crew that he's put together.
It really is, and that's one of the things I think that makes it so unique. There's a cohesive story here, but at the same time, it's almost like an anthology series because you have these directors that have a chance to put their own spin on the telling of an Indiana Jones tale. And yeah, like you said, fantastic cast and crew, directors, writers, filmed in 23 nations around the world. Of course, it was George Lucas, and this was a passion project, and he wanted to do this well. And Chris, to your point, yeah, there are these oddities, but it is so incredibly watchable, and it's such a great hook for teaching. And what George wanted to do with the series is not create this comprehensive telling with a deep dive of every story. It was to just scratch the surface and really leave kids wanting to go back and say, I want to learn more about that, and then go from there. That's what the documentaries were created for as well. So you could go deeper into the story. And some of those documentaries are incredible. I mean, Lines in the Sand is one of the best ones I've seen on the conflict in the Middle East, going back to the Treaty of Versailles, and explaining why we are where we are now, all in about 25 minutes. I mean, there's such rich content in those documentaries also. So,
do they only exist on DVD?
They do right now. Currently, they do. They're harder to find than the films on YouTube, but I'll tell you, they are incredible. So we had the pleasure of working with David Schneider, who was the producer, along with Sharon Wood, of those 94 films, documentary films. Well, they were created to be about 25 to 28 minutes long, so they could be used in a classroom. So a teacher could introduce, show it, and then wrap it up. And we did that quite a bit with teaching teachers how to do that. At that time, I was out of the classroom, so I never got to use them in the classroom, but Wes was. And Wes, my partner Wes used them all the time in class, and they were fantastic. While people look at, oh man, history, like real, especially with the Great War, there's so much content, so rich and so well done. And people sometimes would scratch their head, I guess, and say, but it's Indiana Jones. I say, and that's exactly why it works.
Am I the only person who did anyone else sort of sit watching them and then find themselves on Wikipedia looking things up? I was like, de Gaulle. Surely de Gaulle wasn't in a prisoner of war camp. Look at, he was. Oh, okay.
And then I spent the rest of the episode going, but he stayed in a prisoner of war camp until the end of the war.
Well, when Indiana Jones interacts with other characters, and this is, long-term listeners of the podcast will know that this is one of my favorite things that happens in media, when you get like the main character and they get introduced to famous historical figurington, and often it's kind of like, oh, have you met this random German who happens to be called Adolf Hitler? And then it's for the audience. The young Indiana Jones ones are chock full of it, and I loved every minute of it. It's like, oh, I'm now meet Siegfried, who will read you some poetry, and then you bump into Charles de Gaulle, and then, oh, look, it's Manfred von Richthofen.
They do get that slightly wrong though, the Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, because they prefigure Robert Graves' nervous breakdown.
Right, they do. But see, I never knew Graves had a breakdown until I saw that. And I think that's where some of the creative license with storytelling. I mean, even, when you get off the train in Trenches of Hell and it's early August and there's steam coming out of everybody's mouth because it's so cold when they're filming on set, there are things that, don't quite fit. And Norman Rockwell is not in Paris for Indy to meet when he's just a kid and go to the Louvre with Rockwell. But I think the conceits that they take are trying to get the kids involved in doing the research and
introducing the historical figures to them.
It's just a question of us being consistent as much as anything else, because having banged on about sort of historical accuracy in Benediction a couple of episodes ago, an episode ago, we probably should just flag up that we do spot these things even when we're enjoying the medium.
Absolutely, there are anachronisms.
It was some of the, and I'm thinking particularly Trenches of Hell, is some of the footage stock footage that they're utilizing?
Good call. It's actually from All Quiet on the Western Front, the televised series that CBS did. That's some of that footage is from, and they also use some of that footage or in Verdun as well.
Okay. Because there were moments when I was watching that, and there's a little bit, because obviously, it's the 90s, and there's a little bit of kind of, people superimposed over backgrounds. But they take this German trench and then they get counterattacked on, and like somebody looks over the top and there's like 10,000 German soldiers and a lot of horses all heading in their direction.
On a TV budget.
Yeah. That's only on the screen for 3 seconds. How much money would that have cost to film? And also, where are those horses going?
Right. I'll tell you this, though, too. They also used in Daredevils of the Desert, they used footage. The attack on Beersheba is from the Light Horsemen. And they splice it very well together. But cost savings, right?
Yeah, it's expensive to film an enormous thing.
I mean, I suppose that was I think a little bit my criticism of Trenches of Hell, which I liked less than Hawkman, was the same issue I had with our review of the more recent All Quiet. There's just an awful lot of relentless fighting that took up, particularly the first half, because it's the 2 episodes joined, isn't it? And it felt like if that had been a single episode, there's not a lot else that happens, particularly because the whole plot narrative of the French soldier who doesn't like Indy, or the Belgian soldier who doesn't like Indy and may have killed their superior officer. The plot sort of fizzles out, I felt, in that one. And it feels like they just got the balance wrong between plot and fighting background of that one, as if they got hold of the stock footage and thought, let's make the best use of this that we possibly can. But that was my biggest criticism of the two that I managed to watch.
That and the Verdun, what I thought was noticeable was that actually the lack of mud. I thought, how could surely they have everyone, if you made that now, everyone would be clarted from head to toe in mud. And I thought it was an interesting trope to avoid, is the not having the fire brigade spending, thousands of gallons of water on the fields and traipse through.
One of the things I liked about Trenches of Hell, well, actually, I liked it about all of them, is there's a kind of an interesting subversion of expectations going on, because the whole of that first part of the Trenches of Hell is taking that German position and then that kind of castle chateau thing at the top, and then he's there with the French lieutenant who's in charge, and they're chatting, and he's dead. And then everybody dies, and everybody gets captured. Firstly, being friends with Indiana Jones, real risky, because you are liable to get offed in just like that at literally any point. But you end up with this kind of it momentarily hints at where you think it's going to go, and then nope, we're moving off to somewhere else. So you've been captured and everybody's dead, or that kind of dividing up of, again, the episodes into particular times, but also the ways in which it shifts the location. But Indy remains the kind of the constant thread, even though, he gets beaten up, he gets captured, he gets shot down at various points. I found interesting, because then he goes into the prisoner of war camp with his friend Emile, I think it is, who British viewers will remember from the film Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, and a variety of other British productions. And then they're both escaping, and Emile's got killed. And Indiana Jones, they work their way through the supporting cast really ruthlessly.
Yeah, and what's interesting is Indy's not always the centre of this. He's sometimes only a bit part actor in the events that are happening. So, the Verdun episode, he's just a dispatch rider. The story moves along really without him. He's just there to make sure that the camera's there looking at Indy when the decisions are being made to move the story along. Because he has no agency within that story, but he's obviously central to the story, carrying the dispatches.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And the portrayal of Petain, and that, he's really concerned about the men. Actually, when I would use that film in class, we would come back to when we were studying the fall of France during World War II, and Petain's collaboration with the Nazis and the Vichy government. There's another one like that too, Winds of Change, with the Paris 1919, the episode on the treaty and the peace conference. Andy, again, is almost like a spectator in that one. And if you've not seen that one, I love this. I'll talk about the random, he runs into people. He meets Ho Chi Minh, who is there trying to get an audience with the French delegation to present Vietnam's request for independence at this time. And so you do see he's a dishwasher, busboy at a restaurant. Indy is a brief encounter, but again, it's one of those things where it's like, oh wait, Ho Chi Minh, and then you'll go back and I would tell kids, all right, you need to go research that one.
It fits in quite nicely actually with Samuel Hynes' theory of the soldier's tale, and he spells it with the apostrophe after the final S, because his point is that there is that if you take all the stories of the everyman who participates in war and what they bear witness to, the subtitle of the book is Bearing Witness to Modern War, their witness forms one overarching narrative of what 20th century warfare is. He starts with the First World War and goes through Vietnam. And at the end, I love this point that he makes that if you have to summarize it, the story of modern war can be told in a bit of American graffiti, which is Kilroy was here. I was here. I saw, and that is, for most people, the story of modern war. They are the observers of the history rather than the actors. And I think, India's everyman has the potential to act as that in that way as well. He's the witness rather than the actor.
I love that. Well, my research, I traveled to the Western Front, spent a month researching trench papers. And I was on NEH grant, National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And we studied, there were, maybe I think a cohort of 15 of us with a couple of professors from Wright State University, one history professor, one literature professor. And we studied at UCL for 3 weeks and had access to the British Library, the Imperial War Museum, and we had to have a research topic coming in. And mine was the common man's view of life in the trenches. We know so much, so much is taught about the war poets, but I wanted to see what, the man in the trench had to say. And so Wipers Times, oh my gosh, loved, when I discovered that. And luckily I came home with a volume of it. I was excited to find that used bookstore. But, and then the Blighty publications, and then the Anzac book, all of those things, just trying to get the perspective of what the common soldier's view was, and then compare that with Sassoon and Graves and Owen and the others, Quite a juxtaposition.
Do those poets only appear in that one episode? Because it's only a very fleeting mention they even get, isn't it?
That is. That's the way to introduce it and move on.
Move on, yeah. Which happens, unless this is like Mata Hari is all about Mata Hari, or the specific topic. They do very much crack on, don't they? Meet somebody, move on.
I don't think we covered this earlier, and you may or may not know this already, but the reason that George really wanted to focus on this time period is because he personally believes that, and has stated this, that so many events of the early 20th century were pivotal to shaping everything that came afterwards, and that those events are frequently overlooked for the result, but focusing on the results of those events, but not the causality, or not the things as kind of the bedrock. And so, and again, when you're teaching U.S. history in the United States, or world history, most American curriculum, when you get to that time period, you kind of gloss over everything to get to the Great Depression, to get into to get into World War II and beyond. But it's that pivotal time when you've got the thoughts, like Freud, and the art, when you've got this, all of this incredible happenings politically and philosophically and artistically, a lot of that gets glossed over. And so I think this was a way for George to say, hey, let's go back and let's look at this and appreciate it for what it is. There's
also an opportunity for him. Again, what you were talking about earlier on, Thomas, with, particularly, so the way that you use that Verdun episode is, show, because, this is pretty bleak, awful stuff that's happening here. And it is kind of very, very contrary to kind of the heroic visage cinematically and kind of popular culturally of the Second World War. Obviously, with its bleak aspects, there's a very different heroic undertone. But when you're talking about George Lucas, to an extent, all roads with George Lucas lead to Vietnam in some way, shape, or form are going to end up taking him to the Vietnam War. So there then becomes an interesting opportunity for someone like him to look at the First World War and to look at Vietnam in different ways and go, let's look at these two in comparison to an extent.
Oh, talking about taking two things in comparison, early 20th century, later 20th century, there's an incredible clip. Have you guys seen Mystery of the Blues?
No, I haven't watched that one yet.
Okay, you need to find that one and watch that. So it's when Indy is at university in 1920 in Chicago. His roommate happens to be a young man named Elliot Ness. And he and Indy both meet a young Italian up-and-coming man named Al Pacino. Oh, my God, Al Capone. Al Capone. But he's actually working, Indy works as a busboy in Big Jim Colosimo's restaurant, which is Colosimo's was a real restaurant. Big Jim was an Italian mafioso. And Sidney Bechet, who is a famous jazz clarinetist, really more famous in France than he was in the U.S. until recent years. But Sidney played there at Colosimo's. And so Indy learns about jazz from Sidney. And, of course, George loves jazz as well. As part of that, he takes Indy to church with a family that he's friends with. this black church in Chicago, right after the Chicago race riots. There's a conversation around the dinner table after church, Sunday lunch, between the young son who was a World War I vet who's come back and is experiencing the same racism he experienced before he left. And then the dad who's sitting at the table, and the son, this conversation comes up about, the events of this, the racial tension still in the U.S. even after service by these African-American soldiers. And the young man is really about, we have to stand up. We have to fight for our rights. And the dad is more of Booker T. Washington's approach, which is, okay, let's do our work. Let's prove that we can earn that respect. And you've got Du Bois and you've got Booker T, which is a wonderful juxtaposition years later between the same parallel between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And so I would actually use that episode, that one Sunday lunch I would use when we were talking about Malcolm and Martin's work in the 1960s. And so, yeah, George does a great job of creating these situations within the context of the early 20th century that are very relatable and teachable to events in the later 20th century as well.
Well, how did the series come to an end? Because there's a gap between 1920 and whenever the Raid of the Lost Ark is, 36 or something?
Right. So yeah, that episode, I'm thinking Hollywood Follies was, and I should know this, but I think it's like 1921 or 22. I'm thinking it's 21. And the series, of course, was canceled, had a new life when the Family Channel picked up Attack of the Hawkmen or aired that film. There was another season. I take that back. There was another season that was planned, and those scripts, the outlines of those scripts have been written. In one of those, he was going to first meet Renee Belloc, who we see in Raiders, because in the Indy novels, you do have, and in the comics as well, there's a history between the two where they actually were friends at one point, and competitors. My understanding is from those scripts is that they were only going through the mid-20s. They weren't going much further.
Presumably, at some point, he has to go get his doctorate or do whatever it is that turns him into a professional archaeologist.
And in that case, actually, what he does is he studies under Abner Ravenwood, who is Marion's father, when he goes back to university, and that's in the late 20s.
I would absolutely watch an episode of Young Indiana Jones Chronicles where he's just like in the library, and then another one where he's got his Viva. He's just, slowly working his way through his doctorate. And they'd have to find increasingly spurious reasons to have famous people walk in. It's like, no, this room is occupied. You can't just keep coming in, Bertrand Russell, and the President of the United States.
I find it interesting that it got cancelled because it's got, if you think about other things around the time, you've got other nonsense programs, like the A-Team. This is as much fun and daring do with a historical twist. I mean, I wonder what did it in for it. Is it too much First World War for the American public?
I think it was too much highbrow for the American public. We're sitting around as a bunch of lovers of history who are like, this is incredible. I think there were a few things that did it in. One, when people hear Indiana Jones, they expect to see Harrison Ford, and they show up for Harrison. Now, he does serve in as a character or shows up as the character in the bookends for Mystery of the Blues, which is worth watching just to see Harrison there. He's filming The Fugitive at the time, so he has his fugitive beard, which is great. You see an Andy with a beard, But there was some confusion. People show up thinking it's Indiana Jones, and then you got these kids running around. Okay, then there's a lot of history. There's a lot of thinking involved, and it is daring do. There's also a lot of daring do, which I loved, and I thought personally it balanced well. But one of the things that killed it is that ABC kept moving it around. Time slot wise, it never could build a consistent audience because it was constantly being moved around. They couldn't find a time slot in which they decided to just leave it. Have a combination of those factors, and it did it in.
Because I only watched 2 episodes. It's the summer holidays. I have kids. And my daughter doesn't do mild peril well, so I'm slightly limited what I can watch as a family. But between the two, there was definite variations in tone. So Trenches of Hell was a war film, and there was all that violence with the meetings with Sassoon and Graves, and then with de Gaulle. Whereas The Attack of the Hawkmen, which I loved because it first of all, it felt closer to the Indiana Jones films, which is what I'd seen before, but it also felt quite close to the classic First World War adventure spy films. This was John Buchan, a variation on John Buchan to some extent. And Mark Warren as von Richthofen was just fantastic. But all that spying and the creating the camera out of the box and the over the top Hugh characters when he's getting all his spy equipment, it felt much more like adventure fiction, whereas Trenches of Hell felt a bit more like history. So I'm wondering if is that variation in tone there throughout? And I'm looking at my co-presenters who watch more of this than I have.
The Mata Hari is a love story. I mean, basically, she smiles at him, but before you know it, it gets incredibly racy with Indy almost, climbing out of his clothes as fast as he possibly can. I was, oh my good grief! I can't imagine watching this with my parents at a Saturday tea time.
It never aired in the U.S. It only aired in Europe.
It's very, very racy, is that one, compared to the other 5 or 6 I watched, which was stoically, which I would put as, this might not mean much for an American viewer, but it's the Doctor Who kind of Jeopardy. Most of the ones that I watched, where you Saturday tea time, you're at the back of the sofa a little bit worried, but that one was just a step above that was the Mata Hari episode.
Yeah, so I wonder if in trying to sort of match the history that it becomes too difficult to have a consistent tone across all of them. Might have been an issue as well.
I wondered if it was the directors.
I think some of it had to do with that as well. I think some of it had to do with the directors and the writers, because there were a lot of different writers that were given liberty to take a crack at the stories. There's one, oh my goodness, that's Hollywood Follies is kind of slapstick parody of Hollywood. It's very self-deprecating, aimed at Hollywood, which of course George left off famously, and retreated up to the Skywalker Ranch, which I love that about him. But there's one too where Indy is again, he's in Barcelona as a dancer in an opera, and again, there's some humor that's very, very sticky in some of these. And then you have some like where he faces Dracula, so which that one also never aired in the U.S. It was pretty bloody. I was like, okay, that was an interesting choice, but hey, you face down the wrath of God. And
there's spooky stuff in Indiana Jones films.
Spooky stuff in Indiana Jones, so I had no problem with that. I'm just like, okay, Vlad. So that was actually, I think that was kind of funny. But if you like the spy ones, there are some that are very serious tone where he's doing that, where he's trying to broker peace or he's trying to be the middleman with the Austrian peace delegation. I mean, or the spies that are trying to get a message that the Austrians are wanting out. And then you have when he's in Russia, when you see Lenin, he doesn't really engage with Lenin, but you're seeing Lenin at giving this speech. And so there is a great variety in tone. I'm glad you point that out, Jessica, because there honestly is something for everyone. And we've talked a lot about, these with Sean Patrick Flannery, who does an amazing job. But if your daughter isn't, up for the mild peril, the ones with Corey Carrier are very well done from a child's perspective and those are more about world cultures. So when he goes to China, you're introduced to that, the ancient Chinese civilization. One of my favorites is when he is in Benares and he meets Krishnamurti and the Theosophy Society. That one's all about the Theosophy Society, which I'd never heard of until that episode and didn't know anything about Krishnamurti. And then there's this, in about 5 minutes, little Indy and young Krishnamurti walk around Benares, and he explains to Corey Carrier the basic tenets of the 5 major faiths of the world in about 5 minutes in a beautiful way that children can understand. That's one I use as a clip too when I taught ancient religions. or world religion, excuse me, in ancient history class. And so there, the tone is very, and I think that's something too, Angus, going back to about the cancellation. These did not play out chronologically. They weren't released chronologically. One week you might get Corey Carrier, and next week you might get Sean Patrick Flannery for 2 episodes, and then the next week after that you're back to Corey Carrier.
It's very difficult when you were trying to work out when I was sat there trying to work out which episodes to watch, and then trying to work out what number which was in series. Well, why? And they jump about all over the place.
How did they deal with the language with some of the episodes in like Russia and China and the like? Because one of the many things that I liked about Young Indiana Jones is that they're playing by a low rules, which might not necessarily mean anything to an American audience, but
they're extremely loose. Some of these rules.
You know, Allo was an English sitcom where it was set in Second World War time France. All of the characters are speaking English, but they're not. They're actually speaking French. It's just that they're speaking English because that's what I understand. And Indiana Jones does it all the time. He'll turn to Remy or a French officer, and he'll speak to him in English, but he's actually speaking French. Then he'll turn to Manfred von Richthofen, continue to speak English, but now he's speaking German.
But the person speaking back speaks with an accent.
Yes. And no one notices that he's got an American accent, but then he'll turn to Siegfried Sassoon and speak English, but now he's speaking English. So does that same thing happen when he goes to Russia and when he goes to China? It just happens that or do they have a translation issue going on?
Well, there's in the very first episode when he meets T.E. Lawrence, and he's a little boy, okay? Lawrence tells him, he says, Henry, wherever you go and whatever cultures you encounter, always learn the language, because language is the key that opens everything. So you get this, and especially in the Corey Carrier episodes, where he's just a sponge and he's trying to learn different things. I'm trying to think. Yeah, sometimes they use subtitles, and sometimes, like in the Chinese or the China episode, but with the people that are mainly interacting with Indy, it's English with an accent, you know. And again, it's an American television audience. So.
In Attack of the Hawkmen, they had the German police officer who speaks in German to emphasize the fact that he is a spy and is trying to hide the fact that, you know, he has to speak back in German, and he sort of stumbles over everything.
Well, remember, if you saw the Verdun episode, they actually they check Indy's German before they send him over and make him speak German.
And if in the Suffragette episode, he has the language off with the Elizabeth Hurley character, where they see who can speak the most languages, and they're just going one after the other. Must do 10 or 12 languages that they suppose can speak, but they are speaking those languages and not, putting on an accent.
Amazingly enough, Sean Patrick Flannery can still remember those lines in German. But yeah, it's pretty much the way they handled it, Chris. To answer that question is to circle back to that, is it's often with English with an accent.
Yeah, which is
like Richtofen,
the most understandable way for it, and it's still fun.
It's wonderful. And I like the sort of the modernity to the idea that you release a TV series and then eventually you release the DVDs that are explaining the TV series in the factual sort of. You could go. Oh, well, let me just look that up on the DVD. And the DVDs, I think, are multimedia, which was such a big thing in the 90s. The world was going to be a little disc that you put in and it's all multimedia. And almost as those are coming out, they're eclipsed by the internet.
Well, there's one thing too that comes out with the DVD series is there's an interactive timeline that's brilliant. If you've never seen that, you can actually, if you go to YouTube and look up Young Indiana Jones interactive timeline, you can see some demos of that. You have every historical figure that he meets, and then you can play it across the timeline. It's beautifully illustrated. It was really cutting edge for 2007. And then you can just click on a personality and take a deep dive into learning about them with film clips and text. And then you can group by episodes, you can group by topic. So it's a really, really well done teaching tool. And then there are also each of those 3 volumes had a lecture by H.W. Brands on the historical significance of that era, which were good as well. So you were getting a lot in these DVDs.
So can I ask, in terms of the effectiveness of this as a teaching tool, do you know if any of those pupils who put together your exhibition. Did they go on to study history or to do anything with history thereafter?
I can tell you this. I can't think of any that come to mind off the bat that were involved with that became history majors or anything. But I can tell you that I run into students, my former students, all the time, because I've lived in the same town in which I taught for, this is year 33. And they'll say certain things they remember is, hey, coach, because I coached football also. They call me coach. So, coach, I still tell my kids about learning mythology with Star Wars and the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell. And I can talk about the Dark Road of Trials and the return of the hero. And these are kids I taught 25 years ago. I still call them kids. These are folks I taught, 25 years ago. And the other thing they say is, and man, I love when you showed us young Indy, all those Indiana Jones things. And so, they still have enough interest that they retain that and they're sharing it with their children, which is to me is a win. If I can get any student to recall a lesson I taught 30 years later, hey, I'm taking that one to the bank all day long. I still had kids tell me, hey, I remember everything you taught us about the story of Gilgamesh when you spent that day telling us about Gilgamesh or telling the story. And so, yeah, I count that as a win. So Indy's right up there with it. I don't have the data on it, but I have the soft data on it.
And yet when I talk about those Star Wars things, I get told to leave dinner parties or stop ruining our academic conference.
Chris, you need to call me more often, my friend.
No, we just offered him his own podcast.
Well, as we hit the hour, shall we leave it there and wrap things up? Chris, what are we talking about next time? I don't think we have a clue, do we?
No, but I think that the time has come for me to contact the chap who did the book about the First World War and modern horror for a Halloween-esque episode,
Paul?
as it will be. Yes, Scott Paul, who did. It's a great book, and do that for our kind of October episode, because obviously we'll be recording something in September in Canada, but it seems a little tricky to expect Angus to edit that on the plane home.
We can do that one as our Armistice Day episode.
Yes, before Christmas with Mark Connolly.
Yeah, indeed. We still have to do War Hospital. It's out now, isn't it?
I don't know if it is out. I think it's very, very imminent. But yeah, no, don't worry. I'll be ruining your life with that computer game very soon.
I was going to say, you've been threatening me with it on the internet.
And I've got a copy of The Grizzled, which I meant to play this summer, and I never quite got around to doing.
Yeah, I need to do that too. Yeah, well, it'll be one of those, presumably, or not.
Tune in and find out.
Thomas, thank you for your time. Just to remind everyone, it's indyintheclassroom.com, and you, I've got what your Twitter. What are you on Twitter? Indy in the Classroom on Twitter.
Yeah, Indy in the Class.
And Star Wars in the Classroom.
Right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, friends.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Bolivian? Oh, it's a lovely war.